Hello, welcome to the seventh and final Twin Talk in this series looking at the interconnected digital twin. I'm Tom Hughes, delivery lead for the Digital Twin Hub and the facilitator for this Twin Talk series. Today I'm introducing Mark Birkin. Mark is Professor for Spatial Analysis and Policy and Director for the Leeds Institute of Data Analytics. Mark is also Programme Director for Urban Analytics at the Alan Turing Institute and a Turing Fellow. Mark is a Principal Investigator for the Economic and Social Research Council Centre for Doctoral Training in Data Analysis and Society, and Director for the Consumer Data Research Centre. Before handing over to Mark, just a couple of pieces of housekeeping. Mark, myself, and other members of the CDBB team will be online for a live discussion at 10:30 AM on Tuesday, so please bring your thoughts, questions and challenges to the DT Hub. Also, just a reminder, a week from then, we'll have a live roundtable discussion where all of the speakers from this series will be online, so please join us then. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, hello, I'm Mark Birkin. I'm Programme Director for Urban Analytics at the Alan Turing Institute, and I'm going to talk today about demographic twins for what-if scenario planning. So I'd like to say something about the development of a digital twin of the population, which can be applied at a variety of scales, from countries right through to neighbourhoods, and support quite wide-ranging questions in relation to concepts and issues such as difference, diversity, inequality, and with relevance not just to academic research, but also to businesses and to government and a variety of other interested parties and stakeholders. I'll talk with a couple of examples in particular about how we can use big geospatial data and methods which we draw from spatial analysis, data science, and artificial intelligence to create these digital twins and the associated scenarios and policy insights. And that's going to allow us to underpin quite an exciting programme of academic research with great relevance to policy and real-world deployment. So before I get into the substance of what I want to say, just a little bit of context from a couple of broader national initiatives. Now, most people listening to this video, I would think, will be familiar with the National Infrastructure Commission's Data for the Public Good report, which was produced around about 2017. And I just wanted to recap a couple of recommendations and particularities from this report. So just starting with the introduction here from Lord Andrew Adonis, the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission. So I want to emphasise, this point here. The report sets out a roadmap towards national digital twin, but it's about creating a model of infrastructure which can support simulations, expressed here, simulation of the impacts of possible events, for example, a natural disaster or a new train line. So this kind of thinking about simulation, scenarios, what-if modelling is pointing quite strongly to the sorts of examples and applications that I want to talk about here. And then specifically much later in the report, when we get to the recommendations, we see here a particular recommendation around collaboration between the Centre for Digital Built Britain, the Alan Turing Institute. There's a particular reference here to the ITRC, the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium, which I'll say a little bit more about later on as well. In bringing together these kind of digital twins, again, particularly thinking here about predictive capability, model-based solutions, these really kind of high added value applications to the digital twin. And there are actually some specific reports here, recommendations in the report here about pilot work around these kinds of digital twins. And in a sense, I think it's the progress with these kinds of pilots and demonstrations that I want to reflect on and point to today. So the second high-level report I'd just like to bring into view before we get stuck into the detail is the UK's geospatial strategy for 2020-25, which was launched quite recently, within the last 4 or 5 weeks, with the headline of Unlocking the Power of Location. And again, just reflecting a couple of particular high-level issues, both from the introductory material actually to the National Geospatial Strategy. So here again, the forward from the Minister: the government seeks to unleash Britain's potential to lead the world in the data revolution. So of course, this is the kind of thing that you get from ministers in introductions to reports, but you know, we're thinking about ambitious agendas here. How can we transform things using the power of data? It's not just all about you know, plumbing and data infrastructure and interoperability and these kind of questions. So again, we get this reflected in, you know, something closer to the message about delivery from Sir Andrew Dillon at the chair of the commission. So again, we see here, you know, mission 1, mission 2, safeguard the use of location data, improve access to location data. So, you know, here we're thinking about, you know, relatively basic but fundamental questions about access and availability of data. But then we get into higher value things like enhancing capability, skills, awareness, and particularly enabling innovation. So, you know, my point is here that, you know, I feel we need to be thinking not just about how we improve access to data, how we get the best possible plumbing that we can bring all these data sources together, but what do we actually want to do with them? How can we add a lot of value when we've got this data together, you know, helping in things like decision making and resource allocation and planning and the development of policy. So again, these are the kinds of issues that I want to point at in our work. So moving a little bit now then into more of the details about the kinds of approach that we adopt and the things that you can do with it. So I've talked about this idea, or introduced the idea of there being a digital twin for the UK population. So in the work that we've been developing at the Turing Institute and with other partners over the last couple of years now, at the heart of this, I'm going to say a little bit about 2 complementary modelling approaches which really help to give some of the power to the analysis and the work that we want to do. So the first of these is something called SPENSER, a synthetic population estimation and projection model, and the second of them is a bundle of technologies which we refer to as QUANT, a series of spatial interaction and behavioural models which dig deeper into population behaviours and flows and interactions. So I'm going to say a little bit more about these 2 techniques, and in the interest of time, obviously I'm not going to go in a great deal of detail, but just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that we are thinking about here. So the microsimulation modelling, as the name suggests, is oriented around the idea of representing the population at a very fine scale. So representing individuals and households as unique entities with attributes and characteristics that we can simulate, and I should emphasize here in terms of a synthetic population model. So the essence of the microsimulation is we'll take the national population, we'll represent it as more than 60 million individuals, 25 million households, the full distribution of individuals and households in the country, but it's synthetic, so it looks and behaves, we would hope, in the sense of being a digital twin, a model. It behaves just like the real population, but it doesn't directly reflect or twin to specific identifiable individuals in that population. So if I look at the example here, I have a series of areas that I identified, or actually I'm looking here at a particular output area, medium-sized output area, and within that area I'm identifying a number of individuals and households with particular characteristics. And in this illustration, the kinds of characteristics I'm focusing on are the sex, age, ethnic origin of that population. Then I've got some health variables here, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, blood pressure, and then some information about the socioeconomic status and economic activity of those individuals. So, for example, in the first two lines of this data set, I can see I've got two individuals living in the same household. One is age 66, the other 65, male and female. The first of them looks as though, if they're not now, they're at some point being self-employed, characterized as a small employer or an account worker, and so it goes on. So so we have these synthetic individuals and households representing the whole population, and just to reinforce the point I was making about the non-attribution or identifiability of these entities within the microsimulation. So actually in this case we have data being brought together from three different sources. The sex, age, ethnic origin would come from the sample of anonymised records in the census. The health variables would come from the Health Survey for England, and the economic activity data is drawn from the Labour Force Survey. So different anonymised individual level data sets, which we can use probabilistic matching techniques to bring together to create enriched representations, more characteristics, more detail in these synthetic individuals. And we can vary the sources and the kinds of details that we include here depending on the purpose of our applications. So it's perhaps a good point here for me just to note that we are pulling together here a rich variety of different kinds of data sets and data sources, in this case drawn from national statistics, but often we can be thinking about using different kinds of commercial sources and more of the pure big data, if you like, but that's in a sense a talk for a different day. So now let me say a little bit about the second set of models that we work with. So QUANT is a piece of work that's been developed by the Centre for Applied Spatial Analysis at UCL. You can just about see their logo, the purple square in the top right hand corner of the screen there. And so what QUANT does is in this application we're focusing particularly on commuting, but in general terms QUANT is about modelling patterns of interaction and flows between geographical areas or between geographical areas and destinations. So for example, in related examples or applications, we might be thinking about flows into shopping centres or hospitals or schools. All kinds of things might be reflected in the destinations in which the population is moving towards to undertake various kinds of activities or behaviour. In this case, we're thinking primarily about commuting. So what we have here is a set of flow models which in essence reproduce and with the capability to predict what does a set of commuter flows look like for individuals, for residential areas around the country. So in the right hand side map there, you can see the scale's not great, but we're looking at what that pattern of flows looks like around England. So for instance, you can already see there quite clearly that if in around London, I've got quite a substantial pattern of relatively long distance flows, as you would expect. So commuters being pulled in to the capital of the country from relatively long distances. And then in the other cities, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, so forth, again, you can make out a dense pattern of quite long distance commuting patterns. And then as we start to drill down to smaller cities and towns, then typically those interactions become more concentrated in a small area as we see smaller and more concentrated labour markets in those situations. So what we're going to be thinking about in the examples I now move on to are how we can combine this very detailed understanding of the population and its characteristics and attributes through the microsimulation part. We can think about, represent, reproduce its behaviour and activity patterns through the spatial interaction modelling part, and that can then start to underpin analysis, policy analysis, scenarios, the study of different kinds of problems. So as I said, I want to say just a little bit about two examples of this work. So the first of them is concerned with infrastructure planning. So the specific example that I'm going to look at here is about an idea that, again, some of you will have come across, and indeed some of you may know a great deal about, the Oxford-Cambridge Expressway, or Camcox corridor. So again, we've been looking at, well, there's an announcement here, public announcement in September 2018. So for the last couple of years, about the idea to create quite a substantial investment in new transport and associated infrastructure linking Oxford to Cambridge, including particularly Milton Keynes, but of course a number of important surrounding centres in between. And so with the idea of boosting economic activity and regional development in this part of the country. So again, in terms of the application of our models, we're asking questions to say, well, how is it going to help us to understand our options here, the impact of this thing, what's going to happen and what we would like to happen in terms of the population of this area, and in terms of how their behaviour is then going to change. How can we follow and represent that through these spatial interaction type models to get an insight into what we might expect to be happening here. So in this case, so as I've emphasised from the outset, one of the real beauties and importance of this kind of approach is that we can think about different kinds of scenario, different sorts of options. So these kinds of infrastructure policies and plans and investments, of course, they're not set in stone from the outset. We want to think about different ways that we might be implementing this policy to get the best out of it. So, for example, in this case, we're actually thinking about, well, there are 6 maps here, but you see in the key on the right hand side, essentially 3 different kinds of option around the land use planning and policy in this area. And essentially one of these is around very little development, thinking particularly now of kind of housing, economic development, the things that go hand in hand with the transport infrastructure investment and changes. We're thinking about another kind of scenario of development where we're extending existing built up areas, but essentially adding on to that kind of essential urban infrastructure of housing and services and that kind of thing that we have at the moment, or a more kind of wide-ranging set of options referred to here as future development, where we might be thinking about a variety of things. But so, for example, new ridden developments alongside the roads of new housing and services, or creating, you know, sort of substantial new communities in, you know, maybe in greenfield sites where it's appropriate to do so around the region and that kind of thing. So a variety of different kind of options and scenarios, of which the greater detail isn't really so important for what I want to say today. And just to emphasize, as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, that the particular piece of work I'm relating here is actually drawn from the ITRC Mistral team. Again, ITRC pointed to by the NIC report that I started out with. And I might say in passing that this work is led by Jim Hall at the University of Oxford, but it is quite a big team of 7 different university partners, of which Leeds is one, and indeed I'm also a co-investigator on this particular project. So we have these infrastructure plans and policy assessments that we're interested in. We want to think about a variety of scenarios, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to drill deep into the detail, but we can see, you know, some representations of here of what these sorts of scenarios and impacts might look like if we adopt, you know, these different kinds of these different scenarios, different ways of implementing this transformational infrastructure program that we're interested in. So in this particular case, we're looking at the effect of these different policy scenarios on transportation and movement patterns in these regions. So again, I won't go into the detail, but we can see different kinds of transport outcomes from the different different implementation plans. The second example that I quite like is a similar idea, but thinking about this in terms of CO2 emissions, sustainability, the overall impact of these different plans. So again, one of the really powerful features of this kind of work is that we can think about these different kinds of qualitative impacts, you know, ranging from the transport use, the effect on the environment, the impact on different people's length of travel to work or congestion, house market prices. All kinds of questions are open and amenable to the analysis here. Okay, so I'm going to move on now and talk about a second example, which is even more topical, which is thinking about applications of the digital twin in the current context for the pandemic around COVID. So if I go back to the slide which I talked around a little bit about the SPENSER Microsimulation. So I'll introduce this just by saying we can think about these synthetic representations of individuals and what happens conceptually, if you like, if we introduce a new attribute to each of these people in the population, and I'm going to call that COVID. So, you know, what I'm saying here is that we can use this same starting point, this same microsimulation framework, to think not about an infrastructure planning problem, as we had in the previous example, but about the specific manifestation of a disease and infection amongst the members of that population. And whereas in the previous example I was thinking about quite long-term strategic impacts on people's lifestyle, employment patterns, housing market movements and status. In this case, we're going to be thinking about similar kinds of dynamics, but over a much shorter time period. And we can actually think in terms of our spatial interaction models and that kind of thing about how these people in our microsimulation that we're now seeding with with an infection might come into contact with one another, transfer that infection, and how an epidemic might develop and grow and be transmitted through the population. So a very similar a very similar way of using the models to address quite a different sort of problem. So in this application of digital twin, again, we have the microsimulation conceptually at the top of my slide here. On the left-hand side, I'm saying propensity score matching. I actually need to bring in some different kinds of attributes to my microsimulation to cope with the fact that I want to look at this very specific disease going through the population. I've got a range of spatial interaction models on the right-hand side here, linking together different kinds of activities that are going to create risk and exposure and transmission of this condition. So things like shopping or commuting or schools or leisure activities and those sorts of things. And then I'm going to link these things together in a dynamic model, which actually moves individuals in and out of these environments on a day-to-day basis and creates, as I've said, risk and transmission of infections. So in this example, we've actually got a little bit of a map in our study area of our pilot study area of Devon on the left-hand side there, showing the infection building, growing, spreading, and then being brought under control in that region through a policy simulation in which we're allowing these population behaviours to develop, but then kind of locking it down and restricting those patterns of movement and interaction. In fact, I'm just going to, that went through quite quick, so I'm just going to let that run through again there, while I comment that this is a piece of work which has been actually sponsored and encouraged by the Royal Society through its RAMP programme, the Rapid Assistance in Modelling the Pandemic, and involving principally 4 university partners at Cambridge, Exeter, Leeds and UCL, although actually led from the Turing Institute, again by myself in this particular example. So there we have an example of the application of the digital twin to the pandemic. And again, what's really exciting about this kind of work, well, I guess 2 things I'd say particularly. One is that it's very much focusing on the behaviour, the spatial and social aspects of the pandemic, and kind of complementary to a lot of the work which is taking place around the specific health and epidemiology and medical side. But then the second thing is that, again, we have this same kind of concepts as before, is that because we've represented these what's going on quite richly through our model-based approaches, we can think about playing around with the conditions, representing interventions, scenarios, alternative what-if kinds of things. So, for example, about how we move in and out of a lockdown, we might be thinking about whether the schools are opening, what's going on in bars or restaurants or parks. In this particular illustration, we're thinking about the time periods in which decisions are taken and in which lockdown is introduced. And this is very much kind of proof of concept. I wouldn't present this as definitive research which can inform policy at this stage, although that would be very much our ambition. But for example, if we delay the introduction of lockdown measures by a period of time, in this case a week, we can start to see quite significant impact, I beg your pardon, not delay, and in fact we're assuming that we were able to act more quickly and implement things earlier in this particular illustration, and the effects of that on the spread either across a country or perhaps in a locality, if we're thinking about controls being implemented in that way, are really potentially quite dramatic, and we'd like to understand that a lot better in terms of these local patterns and drilling into our models. So yeah, I'm going to draw to a conclusion, having looked at those two examples, by reflecting that, and I'm going to say here that the digital twin can be applied in a wide range of contexts. We've looked at just those two examples, but even there, you've seen that we're pulling together quite a wide variety of things. I mean, in terms of the Oxford Cambridge example, I've focused there on transport infrastructure, but actually the ITRC group deal in much the same way with energy, waste, water, the delivery of IT, a variety of infrastructure sectors. In relation to the COVID example, you saw that we were putting together intelligence about retail patterns, about leisure activities, about health and hospitalisation, and a variety of behaviours to inform that interest in the essential health conditions. Very importantly, we can use the technology to support decision making, policy intervention, and I've focused a fair amount on those aspects in the talk, with a strong emphasis on the evidence. So, as I said at one or 2 points, quite strongly data driven in terms of the way that we do the modelling, augmented by spatial analysis, data science. Artificial intelligence I haven't said a lot about, but for example, again, in those COVID applications, how do we take our models, how do we represent the data on what we've actually seen, the way that patterns of infection have developed and spread and been brought under control. And there's a lot of opportunity and a need really to use various sorts of artificial intelligence techniques, data assimilation, history matching, that kind of thing, to help us to deliver on those aspects. And as I pointed out at the outset, I think quite an ambitious and creative approach, but it's really looking to exploit the digital twin concept, the geospatial data, the kinds of things that the Geospatial Commission are interested in and looking to promote and bring forward, and to support I think real world-class research, the kind of thing this is very advanced by the standards of what is being done anywhere in the world, but also with a real relevance and importance to practical policy making and important questions of that kind. So I'll draw to a conclusion at that point, and hope I've given you a good sense of what may be possible in the future with these kinds of population-based digital twins.